I'm so grateful you're finally getting your life together. It makes it easier for us to move forward, my mother said during what was supposed to be a family therapy session, and the therapist actually looked at me to gauge my reaction, which told me everything I needed to know about how deeply twisted this had become. I had spent 18 months in individual therapy learning to recognize emotional manipulation, 6 months in couples therapy repairing my marriage, and I'd finally reached a place where I could see my family's patterns clearly enough to name them, and when I did, they reframed my healing as though it were a gift to them. So why did I feel like I'd just been slapped and thanked for the privilege? That's the question I should have asked myself earlier. That's the question that, once answered, would have changed everything. My name is Victoria, though everyone calls me Vicky, and I'm 35 years old. I grew up in a family that most people would describe as functional, which is American code for nobody's an active addict, nobody's physically abusive, and we all show up for holidays. But there's a specific kind of damage that happens in families that are just broken enough to hurt but not broken enough for anyone to acknowledge it. My family was that kind. We were the kind of family that looked perfect from the outside, my father a successful trial attorney, my mother a high school principal, my 2 older brothers established in their careers, and absolutely fractured on the inside. I was the family's problem child, except I wasn't actually a problem. I was just the person brave enough to notice that we all were. The pattern started young, though I didn't have language for it until much later. My oldest brother, Dennis, was the golden child. Brilliant, charming, destined for law school like Dad. My middle brother, Harrison, was the athlete, the one who seemed fundamentally unburdened by the weight of family expectation. And then there was me, the youngest, unplanned according to my mother's more candid moments, and apparently the repository for everyone else's emotional overflow. My mother's anxiety landed in my lap. My father's perfectionism became the standard I was expected to meet and inevitably failed. Dennis's pressure to maintain the family reputation got projected onto my friendships and dating choices. Harrison's apparent indifference actually masked a deep insecurity that somehow became my responsibility to manage by constantly reassuring him he was loved and wanted. By the time I was in my early 20s, I was operating at a constant emotional deficit. I was managing my own mental health crises while also functioning as the family's unofficial therapist, referee, and emotional support animal. When I got married at 24 to someone I met in college, a good man named James, my family didn't view it as my independence. They viewed it as a loss of access. My mother started calling more frequently with crises. My father started commenting on how I hadn't visited in weeks when it had been 9 days. My brothers treated my marriage like a personal betrayal. The first major confrontation came when I was 26 and had my first major depressive episode. I say first, because what I didn't know was that depression ran in my family. Both my parents had experienced it but never talked about it, never treated it, and definitely never modeled what mental health care looked like. I was deeply depressed, barely functional, and when I finally told my family I was seeing a therapist and considering medication, my mother's response was, "We don't air these things publicly. What will people think? What will people think?" This is the American family dysfunction trinity: image, secrecy, and the belief that suffering in silence is some kind of moral virtue. I did get help anyway, against the family's unstated but heavily implied wishes. The medication helped. Therapy helped. And for a moment, I thought maybe I was getting my life back. I was more present with James. I was able to set some initial boundaries with my family. I was beginning to understand that their needs were not my responsibility, even if they'd spent 26 years training me to believe they were. But that's what I didn't account for: my family didn't want me to get better. Not really. They wanted me to be functional enough to continue managing their emotions, but not healthy enough to actually stop. Because the moment I stopped being available, the family ecosystem collapsed. And nobody, and I mean nobody, wants to confront the fact that the people they love have been using them. The first indication came when I suggested we do family therapy. It seemed reasonable at the time. We had real problems. We had patterns that were clearly unhealthy. Maybe if we had a professional mediator, we could actually communicate. My therapist agreed it might be helpful. I floated the idea to my parents, and my mother actually seemed interested. My father was skeptical but willing. Dennis and Harrison were less enthusiastic, but they agreed. We found a family therapist, Dr. Ramirez, a woman in her 50s with an excellent reputation and a no-nonsense demeanor. In the first session, she asked us to each describe what we hoped to get out of the process. My mother said she wanted better connection. My father said he wanted to understand what was going wrong. My brothers basically said they were here because their little sister asked them to be. Then it was my turn. I said, I want us to acknowledge that I've been carrying emotional responsibility that wasn't mine to carry, and I want to understand why that happened and how we can change that pattern. The room got very quiet. My father said, "That's a strong accusation." I clarified that I wasn't accusing anyone of intentional harm but that I'd realized through my own therapy that I'd been positioned as the family's emotional regulator and that it wasn't sustainable for my own mental health. Dr. Ramirez asked each person to respond honestly to whether they relied on me for emotional support in ways that went beyond normal sibling or parent-child relationships. My mother said yes, acknowledging that she'd probably used me as a sounding board more than she should have. My father said he may have expected me to be more emotionally independent than was fair, which was his way of admitting culpability without actually admitting anything. Dennis said he didn't think he'd done anything inappropriate. Harrison said, I mean, Vicky's always been easy to talk to, but that's because she's a good sister. That's the thing about family therapy: when the family isn't actually interested in change, it becomes a performance. It becomes a space where people say just enough to look reasonable while fundamentally refusing to acknowledge their role in the dysfunction. But I didn't see it clearly at first. I thought we were making progress. We went to 6 sessions over 3 months. We used the language Dr. Ramirez taught us. We had moments that felt like breakthroughs. My mother seemed to understand that she couldn't call me in tears about her work stress every single week. My father seemed to accept that my life choices weren't a referendum on his parenting. My brother seemed to accept that I had my own life, my own priorities, my own mental health to protect. For about 6 weeks, things actually were better. But then, and this is important, the family didn't just continue the old patterns. They got better at them. They got covert. My mother stopped calling to dump her anxiety on me directly. Instead, she'd call and say, I shouldn't burden you with this, but I'm just checking in, and by the way, something terrible happened at work. Suddenly I was the one who had to maintain the boundary while she positioned herself as respectful of it, which made me feel guilty for enforcing it. It was manipulation wrapped in the language of therapy. My father stopped criticizing my life choices directly. Instead, he'd ask leading questions. So your firm isn't offering the kind of advancement opportunity you'd hoped for? I noticed James didn't come to the 4th of July barbecue. Everything okay there? He was still gathering ammunition and looking for problems, but he was doing it through the guise of being interested in my life. Dennis started being more present and engaged, which sounds good until you realize that his increased engagement was designed to remind me how much he valued my opinion, how much he respected my judgment, how much he needed me to be the person who understood him best. He was weaponizing vulnerability to create obligation. Harrison did something crueler. He started telling me things and then saying, don't tell mom and dad. He was deliberately positioning me in the middle of family secrets, which is a classic boundary violation tactic. If I kept the secret, I was complicit in the family's dysfunction. If I didn't, I was betraying his trust. Either way, I was trapped. I brought all of this to Dr. Ramirez. In a private session, James came with me because by this point my marriage was being strained by the continued family drama. I laid out the new patterns. I explained that the family seemed to be using therapy language as a Trojan horse to maintain the same dynamics with more sophisticated tactics. I asked if there was any point in continuing family therapy if the family wasn't actually interested in meaningful change. Dr. Ramirez was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I've never forgotten: some families go to therapy not to change, but to prove that they've tried. It's a way to absolve themselves of responsibility. When the therapy doesn't work, and it won't, because they don't want it to, they can say, we tried, but Vicky just refuses to be happy. The problem is her, not us. That's when I understood. The therapy wasn't a path to healing. It was a setup. It was a way for my family to gather evidence that they'd made an effort, so when I eventually had to create real distance, they could present themselves as the ones who tried while I was the unreasonable one. I told my family I didn't think continued therapy was productive. I said we could try again in the future if there was genuine interest in change, but I wasn't going to use therapy as a performance space. My mother was hurt. My father was dismissive. Dennis said I was giving up too easily. Harrison said he felt like I was blaming them for being human. But here's what they didn't do: they didn't look inward. They didn't ask themselves hard questions. They didn't consider that maybe I had a point. Instead, they did exactly what Dr. Ramirez predicted. They started the slow campaign of repositioning me as the problem. The narrative shifted over the next few months. Suddenly, I was difficult. I was unwilling to work on family relationships. I was too focused on therapy and psychology, turning everything into pathology. My mother mentioned, casually, to extended family that I had some mental health struggles, not framed as something she contributed to, but as something that was just a fact about me, something that explained my defensiveness and resistance. Meanwhile, every boundary I'd set was treated as a personal attack. When I didn't answer my phone one evening because I was having a date night with James, my mother called 3 times and left a voicemail about how I couldn't be bothered with family anymore. When I said I couldn't spend Thanksgiving helping her prepare the whole meal because that was essentially a full-time job on top of being a guest, my father mentioned it to my brothers as an example of how self-involved I'd become. The most painful part was that my brothers bought it. Dennis, especially, started taking subtle shots. He'd mention my ongoing issues when talking to our parents. He'd make comments about how good it must be to have a therapist to blame everything on. He was distancing himself from me while simultaneously positioning himself as the reasonable one, the one who didn't carry grudges like I apparently did. James was watching all of this happen, and I could see the frustration building in him. He'd gone into this marriage thinking he was marrying someone with a loving family, and instead, he was watching me be systematically gaslit and undermined by people who had known me my entire life. At one point, he said something that crystallized everything: they're not confused about their role in your mental health. They're just pretending to be confused because understanding would require them to change, and they don't want to. He was right. And what I had to confront was the possibility that they would never want to. That no amount of therapy, no amount of boundary setting, no amount of clear communication would ever make them see what they'd done or take responsibility for it. That I might have to accept that my family would always choose denial over accountability, and that I had to be okay with that, because otherwise I'd spend the rest of my life waiting for an apology that would never come. The last straw, the moment that actually ended my attempt to maintain a relationship with my family on any terms, came at my father's birthday party. We were all there: me, James, my mother, both my brothers, their partners, extended family. It was supposed to be a celebration, but it felt like a setup. At one point during dinner, my father stood up to make a toast, thanking various people for their support and presence in his life. When he got to me, he said something that seemed innocuous: "And Vicky, I'm proud of you for working on yourself. It takes courage to admit you need help." It was phrased like a compliment, but what he was actually doing was announcing to the entire room that I had mental health problems. He was taking my private medical information and weaponizing it as a way to explain any distance or boundaries I maintained. He was positioning himself as the supportive parent of a troubled daughter, when in reality, he'd been a contributing factor to my struggles the entire time. I didn't respond. I just sat there while extended family members nodded sympathetically, looking at me with a new kind of pity. I could see them recalibrating me in their minds, not as someone with her own life and her own success, but as the family member with issues. After dinner, in the bathroom, my mother found me and said, "Your father means well. He's just proud of your progress." I looked at her in the mirror and said, "My mental health struggles are not a trophy for you to display at parties. And if you ever tell anyone about my therapy or medication again without my permission, I'm done. All of you. I'm done." She looked shocked. She said, "Vicky, that's not fair. We're your family." And I said the thing I should have said years earlier: "No. You're a family that made me feel like I was crazy for having boundaries. And I'm not going to do this anymore." I left the party. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. I told James we were leaving, and we just went. What happened in the aftermath was predictable. My mother called multiple times, asking what was wrong, saying I was overreacting. My father sent an email saying he never intended to upset me and that I was twisting his words. Dennis texted that I was being dramatic and destroying family relationships over nothing. Harrison did something worse: he tried to position himself as the mediator, the reasonable one, asking me to give them a chance to explain and making me feel like I was the one being unreasonable. But here's what was different this time: I didn't engage with it. I didn't defend myself. I didn't try to explain why their behavior was harmful or attempt to make them understand. I just said, "I need space," and I took it. And you know what happened? Nothing catastrophic. The world didn't end. My life didn't fall apart. In fact, the opposite happened. For the first time in my entire life, I stopped waking up with a low-level anxiety that something was wrong. I stopped second-guessing my perceptions. I stopped feeling like I had to manage everyone else's emotional expectations of me. What I realized, after months of not talking to my family, is that the relationship I'd been maintaining all along wasn't actually a relationship. It was an obligation I'd internalized so thoroughly that I'd mistaken it for love. Real relationships don't require you to abandon your own sanity. Real love doesn't weaponize therapy. Real family doesn't position your mental health as a character flaw they're tolerating. My family eventually figured out that I wasn't going to engage with their narrative anymore. The calls became less frequent. The emails stopped. They moved on to whatever their internal narrative is now. I'm sure I'm cast as the ungrateful, oversensitive daughter who got too much therapy and forgot how to be a real family member. And I'm okay with that. Because the thing I finally understood, the thing that took me this long to see clearly, is that some people don't want to change. Some families would rather lose a member than examine themselves. And the kindest thing I could do, both for them and for myself, was to stop trying to be the family member who understood everyone, Who forgave everything, who believed that with enough communication and therapy, things could be different. They didn't want to be different. And I finally accepted that I couldn't make them want to be. That acceptance, that willingness to let go, was the only real healing I needed. Not more therapy. Not another conversation. Not one more attempt to make them see. Just the ability to say, this is not my responsibility, these are not my people, and I get to choose differently. Years later, I occasionally wonder if they think about me. If they realize what they lost. If they've ever looked at themselves and questioned the patterns. But I've stopped needing those answers to feel at peace. And that, finally, is freedom.